I'm going to give a brief introduction, and then we're going to have a dialogue together about these ideas and the philosophy of the platform. Let's put it that way. I have heard for the first time about the platform in the internet context about 6 years ago. There's this famous piece by Tarleton Gillespie, which is from 2010, and he is talking about the internet as a platform. At the time, 6 years ago, he described the platform from more like a media perspective that hasn't really been included in your schematic approach. So the media platform is a known term that has been around for a bit longer, and is very much associated with the ideas of convergence, digital convergence, and maybe even earlier, let's say, the multimedia idea. Multimedia meaning that different digital objects, yes, Hugh is here, digital objects and streams are coming together and are being combined. Before they were distinct programs, and the web browser was enabling us to bring together, let's say, audio, video, text, and so on, right? So the platform was a possibility, a technical possibility, to converge different activities online. And this multimedia integration has, of course, a long history. It goes back even 100 years, the idea of these things coming together in one platform. Now, the idea of the platform in the internet context is and has been controversial. Why? Because the platform is an ideal way to centralize online services, right? But of course, in the official ideology of the internet is the decentralizing. It's a network. So if anyone has heard about the internet, the first thing people would notice that it's a decentralized network. So the main force of the platforms is completely going against the ideology of the internet itself, right? So this is producing a lot of tensions, also in the community of the programmers and the geeks who have to build it. And finally, even Tim Berners-Lee, the inventor of the web itself, this year came to the conclusion that the web has gone in a complete wrong direction, and that it has to be rethought in a very, very different way, right? So he has come to the conclusion that the platform is the end of the internet as we know it. And this is an interesting case because for 10 or 15 years, he has been working on the so-called semantic web. And he found out that he was fighting the wrong battle, that he was fighting something which is in itself very interesting from a knowledge and from a scientific perspective, from a perspective of the databases, namely the description of the digital objects and so on and so on. But he has overseen this inevitable centralization that comes with this direction of conversion. Now, the platform, you could say, I think still has a you know, it's a very troubling development, but it also has a great future. So in that sense, I believe that it's very, very necessary also here for Ars Industrialis and for everybody to develop a critical vocabulary and a philosophy of a platform. We need to confront this. It's very important. Also because it's today's you know, way to organize data, to bring together users, and so on and so on. To do this, we need to understand that, you know, in 20 or 30 years' time, we've gone from the idea of media and new media to the idea of the network, and that we are now in the platform. So in a way, it is a third development. First, we were dealing with it from the media perspective, then from the network perspective, which I just addressed, which is maybe a slightly romantic notion of the decentralized possibilities that the network gives, the rhizome and so on, right? But now we ended up in a whole other situation altogether. And that situation is the world that we have just been presented to us, which I think is a very accurate, if not slightly pessimistic, but it's a very, very alarmist, alarmist description. So there is, for instance, in Berlin, we've been publishing the work of Michael Seemann, and there's other people who are starting to work on the theory of platforms. In one of his first books, he writes, for instance, about the demand for platform neutrality. Now, you have never even used the word regulation, but yeah, it's a little bit strange. Also, there's internal regulation, but in every country and everywhere, there's global governance, there's regulation everywhere you look, right? So these companies are nowhere near dealing, you know, in an empty space. They're not operating in a vacuum, legally speaking, right? So he has been developing the idea of platform neutrality, where users demand that a lot of things that Nick has been mentioning here should be turned against the companies themselves. And there are numerous examples already. Europe Against Facebook is one of the many campaigns that is being used. The investigations on the Google monopoly search engine, that is another one. These are, you could say, desperate attempts, right? They are desperate attempts to regulate something that cannot really be regulated, but that's something we need to discuss. Then I think the platform also gives us the possibility to study the more unconscious behaviors that are out there, the desires, but also the aesthetics of the interface, and so on and so on. And there's a lot of work that needs to be done in that field. Because why, you are not explaining it, but why is this network effect so appealing, right? The fact that everybody else is on it is not enough. And Facebook interface designers are working day and night to improve the seamlessness of these platform experiences, right? So we need to study these as well. And one of the things, for instance, that friends of mine in Amsterdam study is the so-called like economy. It's a like economy that is almost not understood. You've touched on it a little bit here. How are the likes turned into money? How is all this data turned into money? And we know very, very little about it. You are right that you know, Google and Facebook make very little money by direct sales. But in fact, there are other companies where you can buy those data. You don't buy them directly from Google or Facebook. You buy them from Axioma or from whoever. There's a lot of data for sale. And there's very little that we know about the political economy of this, unfortunately. So the political economy of platform capitalism is a completely new field. We need to enter that. And now I would really like to you know, open the debate and ask you a few things, because I brought this book by Benjamin Bratton. It came out a couple of months ago. It's called The Stack, on sovereignty, on software and sovereignty, by MIT Press. And it has a large part, in fact, about the platform. So this book, The Stack, the stack is an engineering term. It means that you stack layers, one on top of the other. And that's also how, let's say, we can describe the platform. The book starts with a lot of layers. I think he mentioned 7. The Earth layer is the most, you know, high one. Huh? Yeah, depending on, And then you get the cloud, then the locality, which he calls the city, then the address layer, and then it becomes more abstract, the interface, and then you get to the user layer. The book has a whole section on platforms. So maybe you could respond to Benjamin Bratton and say, you know, where are we when it comes to platform theory?
Thank you for that. That was really interesting. So to speak to platforms in, I guess, Benjamin Bratton's sense, well, I mean, partly he designed the idea in conversation with like myself and Alex Williams and Benedict Singleton. So there's a lot of mutual influence on each other, actually. I suppose my one issue with like platforms, at least in Benjamin Bratton's sense, is that when you read it, he has like a list of about 19 different characteristics for what a platform is. You get this sort of like hyper-specified version of what a platform is. And I don't think all those characteristics hold for all platforms. And it's a very useful first sort of cut at thinking about what the platform actually is, but I find it a bit unwieldy to use in practice. And I find that to be one of the problems with his notion of the platforms, at least as set out within that book. I find his notion of the stack to be much more useful and productive to use.
What is appealing to you about the stack?
I think it's just the visual metaphor. I think the sort of vertical layer by layer
the layers, right?
is incredibly influential. Yeah. And it's also interesting when you think about the way in which these companies are expanding. So you think about, for instance, Google being a search engine company, but it's now buying fiber optic cables. Microsoft and Facebook are actually collaborating together to do a transatlantic cable. These people are basically creating their own privatized internets. And I think this is an incredibly interesting way. And in terms of the stack, it's these companies moving down the stack and giving themselves a ton of power as a result of it. And I think it's a useful image to keep in mind when you're starting to think about the power dynamics of these companies, not just the profit dynamics. Which I guess maybe leads me to my next point, which is I think Bratton leaves out the economic aspect. Yeah. And he said that we need a Marx of the contemporary era, and he's fully. Not going to be the one. Yeah. He fully admits it won't be him. He fully admits his book is not going to do that. But I do think that fundamentally we live in a capitalist system, and if anything, capitalism is more pervasive than it has been at any point in history, and that to just ignore that fact and pretend that these companies are just tech companies or just Google, don't be evil, sort of nice companies, ignores the structural dynamics at play here. They are profit-oriented companies. They have to generate a revenue. This means they have to do certain things in order to survive. I have this, so Facebook and Google, both massively dependent upon advertising, but they're now starting to compete with Amazon. And I think if Amazon was smart and wanted to troll Facebook and Amazon would buy an ad blocking company and develop an ad blocking company as a way to just completely undermine Facebook and Google. I think this is what we should expect. This is like a prediction that I'm making. Amazon will buy an ad blocking company.
Fights?
Yes. Open fights.
Yeah, because so far there's a consensus. Huh? I mean, this is what, let's say, an earlier version, a popular version of the stacks theory was provided by Bruce Sterling. Already in 2012, he came up with his own definition of the stack. By the way, he speaks of the stacks. He uses it not in singular, like Benjamin Breton, but he's using it always in the plural form. So he speaks of the stacks and meaning. Yeah. Anyway, he is talking about the same companies, and he is pointing at this kind of consensus there is between these companies in Silicon Valley not to compete with each other. So that's interesting. The platforms themselves must be somehow, they're competing with outsiders, right? Uber is competing, has a very, very easy competitor, right? They're all local taxi companies. Uber is not competing with Google or something. Yeah, imagine. But now you are saying that maybe in the next phase, the platforms will have some kind of titanic fight. Is that what you envision?
It is sort of what I envision. I think that there's a convergence of these different platforms together. So actually, I think Uber is going to compete with Google, and this has to do with Google Maps. So if you want to do self-driving cars, and Uber wants to have a fleet of self-driving cars, it purchased 47 research scientists from Carnegie Mellon in order to develop self-driving cars. This is Uber's long-term goal. But in order to do self-driving cars, you need incredibly accurate maps of local conditions. Now, Google Maps is the only provider of those maps right now, but this means that Uber is then dependent upon Google, has to pay Google to get these sorts of things. What Uber is doing right now is trying to implement sensors onto their cars so that all of these taxis that are already going around will be able to develop a map, a Google Maps competitor, that will then provide the basis for their self-driving fleet. So this is open competition between Google and Uber eventually. And Uber actually is going to win. I forget what the exact stat is, but it's something like Google maps Europe once a year, something like that, whereas Uber does it every 3 days. So incredibly real-time, up-to-date, localized information about maps. And this is where Uber is going to compete with Google. But then you've also got the sort of incestuous relationships between these companies as well, where Apple is supporting Uber, or are they supporting their Chinese competitor? I forget. But there's all these sort of intricate relationships between all of them as well. When you start to look at who is funding who, why are they funding them, it gets quite interesting quite quickly.
We have heard you mentioning twice the Chinese competitors. Of course, there are a lot of very well-known Chinese platforms these days, and they have so far remained, relatively harmless and operated only inside Southeast Asia or even inside the firewall of mainland China. Obviously, one has now escaped, and that's Alibaba. You could also say the big fight will be between the American platforms and the Chinese platforms. You haven't mentioned much about Chinese platforms. Can you say a little bit about it?
Yeah, I mean, I haven't said a whole lot about it just because I don't know as much about it.
Time to move.
Yeah, time to move, yeah. But no, I think what I do know about the Chinese sort of platform sector is that it is actually more advanced than the American one. And I think that if we want to understand the future dynamics of what Google and Facebook and Amazon are going to do, we should be looking to China in order to be able to learn what's already happening there. And I do think you have the basis for some sort of proxy geopolitical conflicts between America and China eventually. We've already seen Uber lose in China. Uber basically gave up about a month ago, decided that it's same as Google as well. And you know, from a very Eurocentric perspective, it seems like, oh, okay, they're just relegated to China. But actually, these are all of Southeast Asia. It's India, it's China, it's the Philippines. It's a huge number of people. Possibly even the majority. So I think they are hugely important. I think they've been relatively under-theorized and under-reflected within sort of thoughts about platforms right now. I think we do need to look to the Chinese sector more.
Okay. Yeah, you're very dismissive of the folk politics, that's well known. And all anarchist approaches and good, well-meaning NGOs and all my activities of the Center of Institute of Network Cultures, of course, falls under it, maybe Ars Industrialis as well. This is all meaningless folk politics. You want to present a grand socialist vision. Do you imagine large, let's say, Gosplan type of Soviet platforms in order to compete? I mean, I understand that anarchism is small scale and, you know, it's useless and meaningless, all these small initiatives, and I want to think big. You are inviting us to think big. Okay, so I take up that challenge. I understand that the folk politics is not... because I have done a lot of myself in this field, in particular in the social media, and of course, especially initiatives like Unlike Us, have proven your point, have completely proven that you are right, and that us, the well-meaning anarchists, are wrong. So, you know, please make your point.
I don't think I'd be that harsh on the anarchists. There's numerous aspects I like of anarchism. I mean, folk politics, when I critique folk politics, it's the fetishization of immediacy that is the problem. It's not to say that immediacy can't have its uses, and sort of local politics and politics oriented towards small groups of people can't have a role as well, but it's the fetishization of that as the solution to all of our problems that I think is the real issue. Many of my friends are anarchists, so...
My best friend.
But let me talk about the big vision. So, okay, so what I would call post-capitalist platforms, and I think it's a lot of fun to imagine what a post-capitalist platform might look like. What would Gosplan look like if it was integrated with Google and Facebook and Amazon? Imagine, you know, like Amazon has this little Alexa that sits in your home and records your voice. What if it hears that, oh, you've run out of milk, and 5 minutes later you've got a drone delivering milk? You can imagine this is like the ideal sort of post-capitalist platform. It recognizes your desires and reflects them right away. As fun as that is to imagine, I think it's a bad abstract utopia. And I think that sci-fi people can have their go at what a post-capitalist platform might look like, but in terms of practical politics, we need to be talking about concrete utopias. And I don't see any pathway from here to these sort of post-capitalist platforms in the near-term future. So that's why I don't like to talk about it too much, as fun as it is. I'd much prefer to be talking about what can we do and how can we sort of repurpose existing platforms right now in ways that would be much more interesting. So I think about, for instance, what if, so Facebook, as you mentioned, a team of designers constantly manipulating the interface in order to oftentimes use little behavioral nudges to compel people to give more information and stay on site longer and provide more data. Now imagine if we sort of regulated that or did something which sort of took away that incentive. Suddenly we could imagine a platform which was a social media platform, but without all these addictive aspects of it, all these addictive qualities to something like Facebook, where you know, I'm supposed to be writing a talk, and instead I'm flicking through Facebook every 5 minutes. Compulsive nature of that sort of thing. But that's designed into the platform. And it's designed into the platform because it has capitalist incentives to get people to do that. So we can sort of imagine these little sort of minor changes right now, which would already, I think, significantly improve our experience of platforms right now, without sort of jumping to grand post-capitalist, you know, Gauss plan for the 21st century things.
One of the things you kept coming back to is the real existing obstacle of the network effect that alternatives keep on running into. Is there a way to sabotage or to undermine the network effect itself?
I don't know, but I think that's a crucial question. I mean, when I said that Amazon should buy an ad blocking company, I think this is actually one way to undermine Google and Facebook. If Facebook is 96% dependent on advertising, ad blocking is actually a major blow against Facebook. There's an interesting statistic as well. It was from 2014, where I believe $27 billion of ads were blocked by ad blockers around the world, which sounds like a lot, and it was about twice as much money as Facebook made that year. So ad blocking is actually a huge threat to these companies. And I think sort of looking at ways we can undermine them through that is quite interesting. But also, yeah, undermining the network effects is another one. How do you sort of untie the binds that keep us on Facebook and keep us using Google and all of this? It's incredibly difficult, though.
I want to come to a conclusion before we open up the space for discussion. In the book that you wrote, Inventing the Future, you're talking about building a platform more in a traditional sense, huh? Like a coalition politics, right? That's another type of platform. I think that platform was also mentioned by Paul Mason and others, right? It's a coalition politics. That's one approach. The other proposal you make is to found some kind of a think tank. So can you say something about your organizational forms and how you came up with the idea of a think tank and how you imagine a think tank? Would it be something like this here, or can you give some examples?
Yeah, so when we talk about organizations that are necessary for political change in the book, we're trying to argue against sort of organizational fetishism. And this is the idea that if we just get one right organization, we'll be able to solve all of our problems. If we just build up the Revolutionary Vanguard Party, we'll be okay. If we just build up affinity groups, we'll be okay. If we just build up trade unions, we'll be okay. All of these things presuppose that one organization is the magic key to solving our political problems. And I think that's historically wrong, and I think it's also theoretically wrong. I think political change has always been an ecology of organizations. Different organizations playing different roles, doing different things. Now, a think tank is quite important because it is fundamentally about long-term foresight about how things are changing. It's what gives strategic direction to a broader movement. And this isn't provided by affinity groups, which are too small. It isn't provided by trade union groups, which are too focused on reaction to corporate changes. It isn't provided by even political parties.
Or academia.
Or academia, yes. The incentives for a political party are the next election cycle, not 10 years, 20 years down the line. The incentives for academics are publishing as much nonsense as we possibly can. So yeah, I think think tanks serve an important role precisely because they are separated from the day-to-day work of politics. They're separated from those pressures. I mean, they have financial pressures, but still for the most part, they can do long-term thinking in a way that no other organization can. And this is really important for neoliberalism because neoliberalism didn't emerge out of nothing in the 1970s. It came from the 1930s when a group of people, a very small and marginal group of people, thought we want a new liberalism. And they spent 40 years developing it, building up think tanks. They even had a think tank that was devoted to building think tanks. sort of meta think tank, and basically spread their ideas around the world for 40 years before the 1970s stagflation crisis came along, and suddenly they were there with their ideas in hand to be able to actually change the world. And I think that the left also needs to be thinking about this stuff as well. We haven't given it as much thought in recent decades as we once did. And I think this partly has to do with the decline of sort of revolutionary parties as well, where revolutionary parties at least did have a long-term theory about the development of capitalism, this possible final crisis, and what exactly needs to be done in order to take advantage of that revolutionary moment. We don't have that anymore in most countries. And I think think tanks are one way we can start to revive that long-term strategic thinking.
What would make the think tank different from the NGO, which is now the dominant way of organizing, let's say, progressive politics?
I think NGOs are fundamentally oriented towards reforming the system without ever touching any of the problems. I think they're therapeutic in a bad sense. So they take care of the symptoms of the problems without ever dealing with the causes of the problems. Which is not to say they can't do good work. Some of them can at times, but they're not oriented, again, towards radically transforming the system. And this partially, again, has to do with where do they get their money from. They're reliant upon wealthy donors and wealthy foundations, and they can't exactly be making sort of revolutionary noises. But think tanks, I think, can separate themselves from a lot of that.
They sound a bit like 21st century monasteries to me. Huh?
A little bit, yeah. I mean, you separate yourself from society, you go and think for a bit, yeah, and then preach the good word.
Okay. Well, thank you.
I think that the real important question is long-term foresight. Mm-hmm. Yeah. What is long-term? What was said, for example, by Geert about the question of convergence into media, transformed into multimedia theory, and after that, the question of the network, and now the question of the platforms. This was developed by a long-term foresight by the US Army. And today, the question is not platforms. It is a new convergence of biotechnology, nanotechnology, etc. Platforms is already the past. And we have to see that now the investment of NASA, Google, and so many other people into, for example, the Singularity University and those questions is not at all theater. It's not at all a comedy. It is a new business that is prepared now, linked with the Internet of Things and so many other questions. So I think that I would like to go back to what was said by Nick concerning cooperatives, platform cooperatives, and the question of public platforms, etc. I think we have to completely re-qualify those questions. What is politics? What is public in the age of the digital technologies that are what we call digital retentions? The definition of politics is the opening of a public space by publishing. That was created 7 centuries before Christ with the appearance of alphabetic writing. And we have to think new and to make new networks, not only platforms, the infrastructure of new forms of education and contributory research by creating public priority, creating a solvency for investment in such a perspective. And it is particularly the only way in which Europe will be capable to stay an actor at the global level. If not, it will disappear. contemporary private platforms are now based on the short-circuiting of retention and pretensions by automata and algorithms. This is a question of algorithmic governmentality. We have to develop long-circuiting of creation of retention and pretension that are local and meta-local processes of trans-individuation. If we want to understand what is at stake today, we have to reinscribe all of these questions into the question of exosomatization. The question of platforms is only a stage already obsolete of exosomatization. I say already obsolete because the investment of Google into medicine are not at all details. It is a new goal to invest the body, the health, etc., etc. That is the most important market with education at the global level. So the real question is transhumanism, for which platforms are the preparation as data capturing, because transhumanism is based on computation on data, but articulated with bodies, with robots, nanorobots, etc., bio, electronic, etc., etc. As you said, Geert, there was a passage from centralized media services to decentralized internet organization, and now to a re-centralization. But the real question is the World Wide Web. Because it was the World Wide Web which was the origin of this revolution, not at all the internet that appeared in the 70s, 20 years before the web. But it was the web which created this disruption, because the web was a system of publishing. And we have to reinvent the web and to read and criticize Tim Berners-Lee when talking about semantic web, completely destroyed by big data. There was a completely silly analysis of what is semantic in the project of the semantic web. I believe that Tim Berners-Lee is a very great, magnificent applied mathematician and computer scientist, but he doesn't know anything about semantic. And this is a problem for which I was always opposed to the semantic web. That was completely stupid, according to the history of philosophy. Now, what is, for example, what are the stakes of the stack? The stack is producing a new cardinality and a new calendarity. That is also, as was said by Yuc, a new cosmology. And we have to requalify these questions from those questions coming from anthropology, philosophy, etc. It's not at all a question of technology. But technology is a very important question. Why? Because technology is the process of exosomatization. And we have today to completely requalify the current process of exosomatization for asking this question: what is it possible to change into the process of exosomatization that platforms are a stage? What can we produce in such a transformation? This is the question not of a ghost plan of the Soviets, but the question of what I call the Neganthropocene and the future. The other question is, what is the task of noetic workers that we try to be? And the question is, not only the question, the answer I give to this question is, we must invent organologically, that is, by producing new forms of exosomatization, new architecture of data. It's not absolutely not a solution to interiorize the state of fact. And the state of fact that was, for example, explained by Lessig, Lawrence Lessig, code is law. we must, and we can, and we must change the code. Because law is only law when you decide to adopt a code that is right, not a fact. It is right. It is a question for lawyers, citizens, policymakers, etc., etc. This is the question of the Digital Studies Network. Geert Lovink is a member of this network. And he works on the question of publishing. And I think that platforms, the next stage of platforms, if there is a next stage, that is really an interesting one, should be a new meta-locality. I use an expression we developed during the 2 previous days for critical publishing. And this is absolutely possible. We believe in Iri and Ars Industrialis that what we call contributory categorization needs a complete change of the architecture of data. Not at all the interiorization of the data of the platforms. It is already finished with that. If we don't change the architecture of data, it's finished. You are necessarily captured by the model of such a capitalism, that is data capitalism and linguistic capitalism that I call entropic capitalism. And the question behind this is hermeneutic annotation based on a new social engineering. The basic ideas were developed by UQE here with Harry Halpin. That is based not on social graphs by Moreno, but on the concept of psychic and collective individuation by Simondon. This is a question of epistemology, not of technology. And this is the way by which it is possible to produce infrastructures for what I called, in French, I say in French, but I can't translate in English, les dispositifs rétentionnels. What are what I call dispositifs rétentionnels? They are yes, retentional apparatuses, thank you. And what are those apparatuses? They are the social apparatuses produced by a community for defining criteria of selection. Selection being the question, artificial selection being the question of the exosomatic beings that we are. So I think we must overcome the question of platforms and of the stack as it is described here. This is the state of fact. We look for the state of right, not of facts. So, I open the discussion.
Where's the mic?
Voilà, alors donc je voulais juste apporter un témoignage d'une communauté qui est encore très minoritaire, mais qui, j'espère, connaîtra le même déploiement que le néolibéralisme en quelques dizaines d'années dans le monde keynésien. Bon, eux avaient l'argent. Cette communauté a des monnaies locales complémentaires, mais je ne sais pas si ça suffira. Donc c'est le monde des commons, des communs, qui est encore... donc ça n'est pas encore une alternative aux grandes plateformes globalisées, mais c'est déjà, ça permet de mettre en perspective. Et donc, il vient d'y avoir un atelier, un open space sur les communs au Forum social mondial, qui a eu lieu à Montréal la semaine dernière. Et donc, ce que je pense intéressant à partager dans le cadre de ce qui vient de se dire, c'est que c'est d'abord une alternative locale aux plateformes globalisées. Et donc pour montrer en fait le potentiel de ce... En fait les biens communs, il y a des biens communs, il y a des connaissances mises en commun, et c'est d'abord un processus de commoning, c'est-à-dire un processus de mise en commun qui part d'une forme d'organisation jusqu'à la production de choses en commun. Et donc la femme qui est à l'origine de ce déploiement, parce que ça a toujours existé, hein, le processus de commoning, mais la femme qui est à l'origine de ça, c'est Elinor Ostrom, donc une politologue américaine qui a qui n'est pas une économiste, qui est une politologue, donc qui a vraiment travaillé en amont sur le processus de la production de communs, et qui a eu un prix Nobel d'économie en 2009, une femme politologue qui a eu un prix Nobel d'économie en 2009, qui est passé un peu sous silence à l'époque, et qui a étudié de très nombreux terrains de production de communs partout dans le monde, sur tous les continents. Donc elle a accumulé des études de cas en grande quantité, et elle a réussi à synthétiser 8 principes qui sont toujours présents quand ces communautés territorialisées ont développé un système de gouvernance, une forme d'organisation autour d'une autogestion de ressources naturelles, parce que là, donc, elle a étudié l'autogestion autour de ressources naturelles, qui permet un consensus dans la communauté et qui est efficace dans la durabilité et dans l'équité. Alors, je vais rapidement balayer les 8 principes, mais surtout, je vais m'attarder sur ceux qui sont intéressants. Donc, le premier principe, ce sont des règles clairement définies, qui font consensus dans la communauté. Le deuxième principe, ce sont le respect des conditions locales. Et ça permet de mettre en perspective l'organisation des entreprises qui fonctionnent par actionnariat, avec des fonds d'investissement divers et variés, pour des PME par exemple sans actionnariat, mais qui créent une obligation de rentabilité en dehors des conditions locales de viabilité. Et donc on a l'exemple actuellement d'entreprises récupérées, récupérées sous forme coopérative, qui sont viables dans leur écosystème local, mais qui ne sont pas rentables d'un point de vue actionnarial, et qui sont donc laissées en friche, et du coup le fait de les mettre en coopérative permet de se rendre compte qu'elles sont viables dans leur écosystème. Le troisième principe, c'est un processus de gestion partagé par les membres usagers, jusqu'à la possibilité de changement institutionnel, c'est-à-dire jusqu'à la possibilité de changer la forme de gouvernance. Et là, donc, nous avons comme exemple les formes d'organisation de l'économie sociale et solidaire, qui permettent des arènes délibératives. Arène, c'est le terme qu'emploie Elinor Ostrom. Des possibilités de délibération.
Excusez-moi, on peut pas, parce que si tout le monde le prend comme ça pendant 10 ou un quart d'heure, on n'y arrivera pas. En plus, on connaît un petit peu l'économie des commons, si c'est pas une découverte pour nous.
D'accord.
Donc, essayez d'aller à une question ou deux que vous avez adressées.
Alors juste pour finir, je pense que ce qui est intéressant dans le processus des communs, c'est le 8e principe d'Elinor Ostrom, le système de gouvernance imbriqué, qui permet de concevoir des plateformes locales, territorialisées, qui sont reliées entre elles, mais dans une forme de communication, c'est-à-dire que la gouvernance, l'autogestion est locale, et la méta-organisation n'est que communicationnelle. Il y a l'exemple actuellement des transition towns, les villes en transition, qui ont une gouvernance et qui sont dans une perspective de durabilité, d'autosuffisance au niveau local, mais qui sont reliées entre elles par une plateforme internationale qui permet d'échanger de bonnes pratiques et d'avoir de la communication, et le réseau aussi des monnaies complémentaires qui fonctionnent de la même manière. Chaque monnaie complémentaire est spécifique, adaptée à son territoire, et elles échangent entre elles des informations pour des échanges de bonnes pratiques, de la mutualisation de bonnes idées, et une vision globale de ce qui se pratique.
Merci
et ce huitième principe est très important.
Merci beaucoup. On reviendra sur cette question donc, des commons. Ensuite, il y a Youk, s'il vous plaît.
Okay, so that's
on va prendre, excusez-moi, on prend plusieurs questions successives, peut-être 3 ou 4, et puis après on prendra une deuxième série quand on... Vas-y, Youk.
Okay, I just make two very short remarks. Can you hear? Yes. Yeah. Okay, so the first remark is about the use of the term platform, and I totally agree with Bernard, and I'm wondering if the term platform is not itself already symptomatic of what you have described, in terms, for example, of the short-termness and also the limitedness of fight. Now, the reason of saying this is because we look into the term stack, and that actually refers to an engineering principle we call the levels of abstraction. The levels of abstraction, so for example, we can analyze a platform according to the network layer, according to the representation layer, and then go up and up. And it seems to me that platform is only one of these layers that is the interface, or that kind of very only on the surface. Now the problem that I think Bernard has pointed out, and that is problematic, is that Google is not a platform. Google is by no means not a platform. Why Google is not a platform? Imagine, just think how many companies that Google has bought, and what Google is trying to do. For example, Boston Dynamics. That is a company specialized in artificial intelligence and military devices. And this is a totality that is already anticipated since the 1980s, that I will say, I prefer to call it the technological system. So we are actually confronting the developments of different closed technological systems, which is already, Google is already one. And then we see more and more if you look into what Alibaba is doing and what WeChat, which belong to a company called Tencent, which has many business, and they are doing some kind of automatic system. Now, with this notion, I'm referred to the question of fight. I'm wondering if we should not simply denounce the folk politics, anarchists, so on and so forth, but to think up to fight in different levels. Imagine, you know, like if we think of there are many women in the lower class, they don't even know how to use a computer, and they have to be educated, they have to be taught to use them in order to participate in this economy. Now the second question is the geopolitical question that you have pointed out. Towards the end of your presentation, you said the state must do something. Now, I believe that the state must do something, but there is a problem here. I give you an example. Now, that is also the symptomatic or the problem that mentioned by Morozov, and I think that we should repeat it again. Now, Morozov said there is no alternative. The reason, for example, is if you wanted to compete against the American neoliberal models, then the European Union must do something, because only the European Union can create a kind of resistance with the similar scale. Now, the question of scale, which is very important in your book and in your manifesto. Now, this is reflected also if we see what this is happening. This is what exactly China is doing. Now, why? Because China has created a firewall. It creates a firewall in which that the American companies are not capable to compete with the local companies. So this is kind of is it China the best model that we can have now, or is China the model, China your dream model? I am asking this because there is a second relation to that. In your book, you have laid down 4 aims that you want to achieve. Now, let me repeat, because not many people know this. Firstly, complete full automation. Secondly, universal revenue. Third, reducing the working week or working hours. This is actually in the agenda of the Chinese Communist Party. Now, except the fourth one, which is the diminishment of the work ethics, which I believe to be an anarchist principle, but not a communist one. So I'm wondering, what do you think about this?
Thank you. We will have a third question with Olivier.
Je vais parler en français parce que je vais être plus précis et moins long. Il y a un point qui m'a beaucoup intéressé, c'est les lignes plateformes, parce que je n'arrivais pas à placer les Uber et autres dans l'ensemble du dispositif. Par contre, j'ai été étonné que à aucun moment vous ne présentiez l'ensemble de ces plateformes comme pyramidales. Elles sont interdépendantes les unes des autres, et c'est ce qui est redoutable et c'est ce qui rend global ce système économique, et global à tel point qu'il remet en cause la production de marchandises et l'organisation de la production. Et elle s'inspire très fortement, c'est pour ça que les premières plateformes, on parlait de médias, elle s'inspire très fortement de l'économie des médias, c'est-à-dire d'une production de savoir ou de conception en amont et d'un coût de production qui est quasiment zéro, c'est-à-dire c'est une conception, etc. Marx n'a pas pu en parler parce que au milieu du 19e siècle, je cherchais un exemple qui pouvait être une analogie avec le modèle économique des médias. Je ne trouvais que la presse. Et la presse, il y a marchandises, tandis qu'actuellement, il n'y a pas, pour le moment, tant que l'industrie lourde et l'Internet des objets et les imprimantes 3D ne sont pas répartis dans des usines distribuées, la marchandise s'est totalement virtualisée. C'est-à-dire qu'on est dans une marchandise du type média et plus du tout dans une marchandise brick and mortar, comme on dit. Derrière ça, ça veut dire qu'il faut être capable de reconcevoir le modèle économique qui soutient cette nouvelle organisation de la production. Et je m'attendais à ce que vous nous en parliez, et en particulier, il y a des modèles que maintenant on arrive à connaître, qui ne peuvent s'expliquer que dans l'interliaison, dans les liens entre toutes ces plateformes, qui est l'économie des API, qui font qu'entre toutes ces plateformes, il y a énormément d'argent qui circule, et de l'argent qui est quasiment invisible, qui crée un réseau monétaire, entre guillemets, qui mérite d'être analysé. Et jusqu'à présent, j'ai vu quasiment aucune analyse là-dessus. Et ce n'est qu'à partir de ça que, me semble-t-il, on pourra commencer à avoir une réponse et une attaque, et savoir comment la puissance publique peut intervenir par rapport aux plateformes, et pas aux plateformes, mais aux nouveaux modèles de la société digitale.
So we've got to the point with contemporary platform capitalism, where nothing is any longer being produced, exactly as you were saying earlier, Nick. We see a convergence between the kind of absence of commodities, absence of production at the level of the platform, a convergence between the media economy, which also produces nothing, and the platform economy. We can map that in turn onto current financial speculation, which equally produces nothing except its own internal circulation of vast quantities of money. Isn't it on this basis that we need to start thinking alternative economic models?
And specifically with the question of API and the functional role of API, that is extremely important. And another question that was the first part of the question by Olivier was the system that platforms produce together. That is what was called, for example, by Bertrand Gilles in France, a technical system. And this is extremely important to have a global view, because there is a complementarity between those platforms. One cannot work without the others.
And also, what's the role of public power in this?
Yes, of course.
At the same time, it's centralized about management, but it's technically completely decentralized.
Yes. He said at the same time, it is centralized for the management, but completely decentralized, geographically speaking.
Okay, I'll try to deal with a number of the questions. I probably won't get to all of them, but harass me afterwards if I don't answer. So the idea about folk politics, I know this is like a really contentious thing and some people absolutely hate it. Is the local necessary or is it useful? I think the local is absolutely necessary. The problem is, it's simply not sufficient. It's not enough to be focusing on the local. Give an example, of a commune. A commune is great and it serves plenty of nice purposes. It does nothing to stop neoliberalism. It does nothing to stop global capitalism. And I think that's the real challenge, is moving beyond these localized spaces where we can create alternative social relations that are quite ideal and quite nice, but how do we actually transform the rest of society beyond that tiny little sort of space of respite? So I think the local, oftentimes, and increasingly slow, is defensive. And I think we need to get beyond just defensive politics. I think we really need to be thinking about what are the biggest power centers in contemporary capitalism, and I think platforms are one of them, and then how do we undermine them? And I think that this is the sort of strategic analysis that's necessary if we're going to be taking a sort of active approach to things. Now, this necessarily means building up from the local, and the local can't be rejected. The local has to be melded with the urban level, it has to be melded up with regional levels, national levels, transnational levels. But we can't remain at the local, and I think that's the real problem that we're trying to pinpoint in the critique of folk politics. Was your question sort of on China and WeChat, was it that China might be the alternative?
No, I'm wondering if China for years now, doing what you want to do.
Please talk in the microphone, because...
So, China is...
It was about the geopolitical question, and I was wondering if China is the kind of the ideal model that for you already, because what you propose is what they also propose to do, and what they have been doing, and the way they achieve this is, of course, we know that they have to close the war and then so on and so forth, and would be that a kind of continuation of your for the end of your presentation when you invoke the function of the state, for example.
So in terms of the demands from inventing the future, then you're absolutely right about full automation. I mean, China is full speed ahead in terms of automation. Millions of workers going to be tossed aside because of the automation of factories. I think the major issue is that even if they did provide something like a basic income, they don't have any sort of welfare state properly built up. And this is the big challenge for the Chinese state right now, is how do you shift from an economy oriented towards producing things, having people save their own money and providing for themselves, towards an economy that is premised upon domestic consumption, where workers are buying goods rather than saving money. It needs a welfare state, and China needs to build that up. There's potential there, I suppose. I won't dismiss that, but I don't see it there yet. And in terms of platforms, I think the Chinese sort of platforms are the future, given capitalist tendencies. I think because of the ways in which the Chinese population largely leapfrog over laptops and desktop computers straight to smartphones, so they got a very high penetration rate for smartphones. I think that they're sort of ahead of the game because of that. And I think that that's why they're sort of the future. The one other quick question, if I understood you right from the translation, platforms produce nothing, and how does this relate to sort of traditional media sector, which again produces nothing? I think actually they're in direct competition, platforms and the traditional media. So who is suffering from the loss of advertising revenue? It's newspapers, it's television, it's all of these old media which are suffering at the hands of Google, Facebook, and Alibaba, which together, those three companies, have over 50% of the world's online revenue, advertising revenue. So it's a huge amount of money going to three companies in the entire world. So I think they're in direct competition. But this leads to a more crucial point, I think, which is that in a sort of traditional Marxist analysis, the media industry is parasitical upon other industries. It doesn't add to capitalism, it doesn't produce things. I think actually the platform economy is very much the same thing. I think it's parasitical on what we might loosely call productive capital. And I think actually when we look at the sort of dynamism of Google and Facebook and Microsoft and Apple and all these companies, I think it's actually obscuring the fact that capitalism is in a lot of trouble right now. I don't think they are signs of capitalism's health. I think they are parasites taking away from other areas of capitalism. And we need that sort of analysis of the totality in order to be able to understand how parasitical they are.
I would like to precise something. The question of what is publishing being also the question of what is money, because money is a system of publishing. So the question of publishing that I tried to address is not well described by, for example, the distinction between infrastructure and superstructure, because it doesn't work. But it's not the question. When we talk about locality, local, etc., it's not at all in the sense of let's have a local experiments at the micro-politic level, and after that let's see what is possible to do by generalization. It is not at all that. It is a question of physics, in which the biosphere is a localization of universal laws of physics. And if you want to criticize capitalism, you must completely criticize the epistemology of Marx and Engels. If you don't do that, you will not be capable to criticize capitalism. Because capitalism is first an epistemological system. And the contradiction in capitalism is entropy. And it is also the reason for which you have a question of locality that is both physical, a question of local process that was described by, for example, Whitehead. This was a reason for which, trying to address this question, we try to reread Leibniz, Whitehead, etc., etc. And the other question being that if we agree for saying that what is produced as a value by the human activity is always something that belongs to, let's call that meaning, signification, etc. It is always produced by a process of localization, by idioms, by what we call no diversity, not only biodiversity. And here there is a question of ecology, of noises, of thinking, of spirit, etc., etc., that we must and can oppose, for example, to Google. For example, by referring to what was showed by Frédéric Kaplan as a mathematician, explaining how the mathematical exploitation of the language of the whole, of the global, at the global level, 500 languages, is confronted a systemic contradiction, that is, the increasing of entropy. So the destruction of language itself. So there is a question of ecology here that we have to specify for criticizing platforms. The question is not first to appropriate platforms, but first to criticize. And it is possible to appropriate and to adopt the technologies of capitalism only if we have a critical point of view on it. And here we have to change. It's not Newton, the reference today. It is the contemporary astrophysics, it's quantum mechanics, it's not the science of Marx.
So, yeah, thank you very much for your presentations. I really enjoyed them. I'll try and be as quick as I can. I like that Geert mentioned the like economy, which I believe is a concept by Galitz and Helmond, talking about how Facebook uses social interactions to create a form of monetization, and the recent expansion of Facebook's like button shows how they're really invested in using social interactions between people to generate money, which, in my view, I think ties in very well with the discussions that we have here on how technology creates entropy. And for me, this is a very entropic phenomenon to use social phenomena and pervert them, short-circuit them, if you will. Therefore, I think a reappropriation of the platforms is definitely a means to move forward. I think we need to think a bit more about what you said about finding new avenues of changing this state of affairs, especially when you mentioned education. Is there perhaps a possibility to remodel these platforms architecturally and within their coding to reflect how they use social interactions, to perhaps open people's eyes up to this fact? And but I'm also not talking about businesses being in control of this, but using other sectors like traditional educational institutions who are very well aware of the dangers that these present.
I'd like to pick on upon a point that Bernard just made with regard to a concept that he and I have been discussing for the last couple of years, namely neurodiversity, and I'd like to use it to put in something of a defense of the local, though I'm far from being wholly persuaded of the local myself. You'll know the statistic better than I do, Nick, but it came out a couple of years ago, something like over the last 10 years we've seen the internet move from a much more diverse selection of websites visited to a situation now where I think something like 85% of internet traffic is funneled through 17 websites. Something like that. This means not only a channeling of economic resources through an ever smaller number of channels, it also means that an increasingly restrictive set of milieu that we're internalizing and which furnish the conditions of our own thought and experience. In other words, I think we can very clearly here talk about a situation where our own intellectual neurodiversity is in decline precisely from the lack of variety and stimulus that we're coming to. Now, juxtapose that with the idea, as you said, which I think is true, that capitalism is not in a particularly strong position at the moment. It wouldn't take a great deal to stop not very profitable companies from not being profitable at all. Even in the bigger companies, relative to their size, profits aren't particularly huge. Facebook is quite a good example there, I think. If we move to addiction theory again, which I've talked about too much over the last couple of days, but the accepted way to break an addiction nowadays is not to abstain, not to attempt to moderate one's usage. It's rather an attempt to diversify the variety of stimuli to which one subjects oneself. And here we might well see a role to play for the local. And we see it already happening with sites. They may be global in inspiration, Grindr, and I can't remember what the other ones are called, Hinge, this kind of thing, which could be done just as well at a very local level, because you're not looking at people to sleep with who are 50 miles away, you're looking at people who are 50 meters away. And so we do see a kind of opening in this place for platforms that are precisely local, and the effect of promoting which would be to cause a weakening not just of the revenue streams of the Big Five, but also a weakening of the attentional hold that they have over us. And that, I think, could be a very powerful combination if pursued adequately.
Thank you. Conrad, you can use this microphone.
Thank you. Nick, you'll be really disappointed to discover, I'm sure, that I'm going to ask my question in English. So I guess I just wondered, in your presentation, when you talked about not necessarily foreseeing a way out of the current constrictions we face with respect to platform and the development of platform. And I want to ask kind of how this connects to, and we were discussing yesterday the different theories of crisis in Marx, immiseration, underconsumption, falling rate of profit. And I want to pose the question, you mentioned at the beginning of your lecture, you were talking about the relative sort of conventional economic unproductivity of many firms in the tech sector. And then at the end of the lecture you said, well, you know, even if, you know, local anarchistic operations probably won't provide us with the solution we need. And even if the government were to become involved, right, in the creation of platforms, this would pose a big risk, right, in terms of abuse, in terms of militarization. And I want to pose the question to you, Nick, is it the case now, right, when we face this large rift between supply and demand, when we face economic crisis, the likes of which I don't think has been seen in decades, is it the case that now that there is a kind of opportunity, right, to fundamentally restructure the class composition of society, right, based on something like, for example, the unproductivity of new firms, the rift between supply and demand, and thereby actually create a political context where platform can be wielded in such a way that it would be, to some extent, let's say, more legitimately emancipatory?
Thank you. And that we stop.
Thank you very much for your presentation, Nick. And I would like to pose a question that is a philosophical question, so you can also don't follow what I will say. But I want to pose this question for two reasons. The first is that here we are trying to rethink philosophy and philosophical authors precisely in front of your analysis, and the analysis about platform capitalism and all new version of capitalism. And the second reason is that in your manifesto with Alex Williams, you posed a philosophical question that is like a reactivation of the famous Deleuzian-Spinozian question, that is, what can a body do? You asked, what can a modern techno-social body do? And this is a great reactivation of the Spinozian question. I say this because yesterday we talked about Frédéric Lordon and his essay to reactivate Spinoza today, but without the technological dimension. And you did it. You posed such a question. And such a question for us is crucial. But what I observed in your manifesto is that you are not asking what this techno-social body is losing. What is losing within platform capitalism with such a platform? Because for us there is a sort of lose of something. Something maybe that is a question of libidinal economy. What I want to say is that we can create an alternative economy, but in order to do this, maybe we have to observe and to reach the element for a new libidinal economy. And when Geert said that network effect is so appealing, I think that such an appealing is something that is to relate to the unconscious of people. And also folks politics is something that works in the unconscious of people. And we can reject folks politics saying, well, it's not so important from a strategical point of view. But what Volkspolitik created during a century, during 2 centuries, is we say collective individuation. That is something that is in the mind of all the people and that contribute to create an horizon. And with such an horizon, we can act. And we can act in an alternative way. So the question is this, which body for your politics and which unconscious for your politics?
Great questions. I'll maybe start with the last one, which I think is really good. So I have to admit, coming from the Anglophone world, I have less sort of time for psychoanalysis. I prefer not to talk about the unconscious, but I think I would prefer to use the Gramscian idea of common sense, which I think functionally serves the same role. And I think this is exactly what is absolutely necessary, and I think you're absolutely right that there has been a sort of unconscious common sense about how politics is done. Our book was an attempt to push on that in its own sort of way. But we do need to create a new unconscious, a new common sense. I think the sort of stuff that Bernard has been talking about and the stuff that's been talked about here is a great first effort at trying to create that new sort of common sense. But it's not something that any one person can come up with. It's something that has to be collectively individuated. So I think you're absolutely right. We need to be thinking about these sorts of questions and developing them much more. The first question on, I guess, alternative sort of education platforms. I know you're doing a PhD on it, so I'll maybe let you answer that in like 4 years. But I think the work that you're doing sounds fantastic, and I think it's absolutely crucial because I do think education, to go back to the sort of common sense stuff, is absolutely essential to rebuilding what our common sense is, rebuilding our basic sensibility beyond what's provided to us through technical means. I think we also have to be integrating education into every aspect of society in various ways. So I'm really curious to see what work you end up producing. On the point about neurodiversity, I think you're absolutely right that these sort of smaller and smaller number of platforms means that our online experience is increasingly a very, very small space, a small environment. And on top of that, you have the fact that you have sort of app designs that all look the same, interfaces that all adopt best practices and copy each other. Things become very, very similar. And I think local apps can help to some degree. But I do have a sort of problem as well. So my own experience of using a lot of social media platforms has to, when I get in this sort of addictive cycle where I'm just going through, clicking on Twitter, clicking on Facebook, clicking on G+, clicking on something else, and nothing new's coming up every time, but I'm just sort of cycling through that process again and again. So I've got a diversity there, but there's still a behavioral addiction to clicking and seeing whether there's some new story that's popped up. So I think it's not just about diversity. I think that the interesting thing about Facebook in particular is the actual behavioral hooks that they embed within the platform that I think is really dangerous. I mean, great for their business, but dangerous for the sort of addictive qualities of social media. So yes to more diversity, but maybe it's not the only, or maybe it's not quite sufficient. And then the point about, I guess, sort of given current crisis conditions, can we sort of recompose a class which would be capable of changing platforms? I think yes, and I think the sort of interesting thing about the 2008 crisis is that we're still not over it, and we still don't see any way out of it. And I can only assume that things are going to get worse before they get better. And I think what the left needs to be doing at the moment is strategizing for when things do get worse and having in place a series of ideas, a series of programs for understanding, programs both political and software, but a series of ideas for what to do when the crisis sort of takes a worse turn again. Things aren't going to get better. I think this is, without even having to rely upon the tendency for the rate of profit to fall. I think you can see that capitalism is in a very deep crisis at the moment. So how do we bring people together? How do we knit together all these different constituencies and start to recompose the people, I think is the sort of fundamental political question for me.
Thank you. We'll have a break for 15 minutes, and after that we have the two last communications. Thank you very much, Nick and Geert. Thank you.